Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Brisbane Jazz Club for another of our jazz appreciation evenings. My name is Alan Weston. It's my great pleasure to present these evenings for the Jazz Club. There are many people who play music, and of those who play jazz, there are many who have a good knowledge of the history of jazz. But I believe that none have studied in quite such depth and with as much interest as our guest tonight. As well as being a prominent musician on the Queensland scene, I believe he could also be cast in the role of a jazz historian, capital J, capital H. His association with the Brisbane Jazz Club goes back many years, so I'm sure you will find this evening's interview very absorbing as we welcome our special guest, Mr. Tony Ashby.
Thank you. It's a lot of here tonight. Yes, very good.
Oh, isn't it great to have an audience?
Yes.
Great. Tony, I've known you for not in great depth, but I have known you for many years since I first started coming to the Brisbane Jazz Club, and this is what these nights are all about. This is finding out about the man behind the instrument or the man behind the microphone, and so let's try and do justice to that this evening. I guess we need to know where it all started. Where were you born and bred, Tony?
Born in England, 1936, in New Malden, Surrey. And I went to boarding school. That was where I became interested in jazz. In those days, there was very little jazz on the BBC, and they had the sort of hit parade, and of course there was no jazz on that. But when I was at boarding school, I remember one afternoon walking into the common room, and a guy said, "Oh, listen to this wheeze." That was my nickname because I had asthma. Listen to this, and he lowered he lowered the head of a 78 player needle onto this disc that was going around at 78, and I thought that was great. And it turned out to be Louis Armstrong's Alligator Blues.
Really?
And that was it. Of course, 78s were the things in those days.
So you were hooked straight away.
I was literally hooked on jazz, and it went out from there.
Yeah.
And I did a lot of reading about it and a lot of listening. We also found that we formed a club called the ABC Jazz Club. That was Ashby, Barnes and Cardew, and one of the guys found he could manipulate the radio in the common room and get, I think on the shortwave station, we get all those great jazz concerts that were coming over from France at that time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we heard those live Sidney Bechet concerts where he'd hold a high note and the French would go wild over it. We also tuned into the American Forces Network.
Yeah. Radio Luxembourg?
No, that actually came out from London, and it was a commercial station in those days. I don't think they had a lot of jazz there. I don't remember that.
They had a lot of American music, but which some must
But we were
jazz.
concentrating on what was coming on over from the continent. So we were listening to all styles of jazz in those days, and the BBC had a jazz program on a Saturday night, and it used to start right after the end of the announcement of the football results for the day.
Okay.
So we'd go into the common roof and it'd be packed with everybody.
And how long did it go for?
The programme?
Yeah.
Oh, it was about half an hour, I think.
Okay.
But the most interesting one that I remember was racing back to boarding school one afternoon on my push bike, just in time to hear them announce that the guest band tonight was Graham Bell's Australian Jazz Band.
Oh, really?
Great. And Pixie Roberts, the clarinetist, apparently succumbed to the flu, so they had the guy out from the Littleton Band, Wally Fawkes, filling in. And they said, we're now going to feature our young drummer who plays some cornet, and that, of course, was Johnny Sangster, who literally learnt to play the drums on the way over to England on the boat. And that was interesting because it gave me a good idea of the feel of Australian jazz. And as someone said, Australian jazz, and when I talk about jazz now, I do refer unashamedly to traditional jazz, okay?
Yeah.
They say you can always tell Australian jazz because it has the sort of smell of the gum leaf about it. It has a distinctive sound and feel, and that is quite right. Later on, I actually organised a couple of bands here at the club which specialised in playing Australian jazz and Australian compositions and arrangements.
Okay.
So that was where I got my first idea of what was going on in jazz.
So what about your schooling, your early life? were you from a musical family, or did this experience at school turn you on to music?
It was the experience at school. No one else in the family.
So you weren't
was
really a muso before that?
No, not at all, not at all.
And how did you actually take up music as a subject?
You mean playing?
Were you self-taught, or?
Basically, yes. Well,
Yeah.
I picked on the clarinet because one of the guys at school had a clarinet.
Okay.
And I was sort of into copying what was going on. And all I can say is in those days I had a clarinet. I wasn't terribly sure which end went in my mouth. It took me quite a few years to work that one out. So I had a clarinet back in those days, but it wasn't for quite a few years.
So was this when you were around about, 14 or something?
Yeah, well, we
teens?
left England just before my 15th birthday, and I had a clarinet then. As I said, just how it worked,
Was that
I
a
wasn't
treat
terribly
from
sure.
Mum and Dad, or did you buy it yourself?
They bought it. They bought it for me because, funnily enough, as I said, back in those, I've had asthma since I was 6 months old. So that makes a darn long time. And what we did find, that playing the clarinet helped with my breathing.
Yeah.
And even my specialist says now the fact that I've been playing tenor sax and clarinet for many years has actually kept me alive. It's as straightforward as that. Because normally I'm at the stage.
I had it as a child, and I grew out of it in my teens. I thought perhaps you might have grown out of it.
I had asthma and eczema, and they told me that about both of those.
One follows the other.
Yep, and I grew out of the eczema.
And got asthma.
Yeah, well, so there's a tremendous psychological background to asthmatics and asthma,
Yes.
and you had to overcome those, really. So I didn't grow out of asthma.
Well, I guess you got lucky in the music, not quite so lucky with your health then, eh?
Yeah, but I'm not sorry about that because I look around the places at all these budding footballers, cricketers and whatever. Particularly in Auckland, you see just about every other person limping up up Queen Street, potential All Black who never made it.
Yeah.
You know, with all the damage done to them. So I never went down that road at all, and I'm pretty pleased. No, I've never been interested in sport.
But also, sports people are over and out by the time they're in their 30s, aren't they? Where music you can do till you're in your box.
That's right. Yeah. Right while they're nailing you down, in fact.
So, was your family musical at all, or did they just pander to your desire to have to play the clarinet? Did they think you had two heads, or?
No, it's just I came home from school one year and on holidays, and I said, "Oh, mate at school plays the clarinet. I wouldn't mind having one." Mm-hmm. If you actually probe me closely and ask me when my first musical experience, as opposed to jazz, and this was told to me by...
Well, go on, we'll probe you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to stop. I would have been very, very young, and we had a wind-up gramophone. Probably way before your days, but
I had a wind-up gramophone.
Okay, yeah,
with the little steel needles.
That's it. Yeah.
You had to change them every record.
And my brother, who's 2 years older than me, we were arguing as usual about who was going to play it. You see, and I wouldn't have been much more than 3 or 4. And he picked up the handle. You remember the handle he used to put in? And he picked it up and hit me over the head with it. And I think that was the first impression I had of music. Mother, of course, was terribly upset. She got the handle out and threw it over 3 gardens, and we never saw it again. But I guess you could say it left an impression on me.
Well, a lot of people say you have to be hit on the head to have a career in music.
Well, I started very early.
So, did you go for formal music training, music
Unfortunately,
lessons?
no. I tried to do that at boarding school, and the headmaster, who was regarded as perhaps the most liberal headmaster in England at that time for a number of reasons, he wouldn't let me have lessons. One, he didn't like jazz, he banned it.
Right.
And two, he just thought that there was no one around who could teach me properly.
Okay.
It wasn't until I went to New Zealand and I met a young guy, a guy who was in a wheelchair, he had polio, and that was really my first formal lesson on the clarinet.
Yeah.
So a lot of it's self-taught. People say, do I teach clarinet? And I say, no, I'm still learning, and it's the sins of the father and that sort of business.
So now when you started to go for these lessons, did you find that you had to correct any sort of mistakes that you had made by teaching yourself, technique? Or
Oh yes, he's pretty good. Yes, he taught me to play the Golden Wedding, which was quite an achievement. But he was good like that.
Yeah. So after that, what age were you then when did you become a musician from leaving school, or did you have a proper job?
Well, when you say be a musician, let's say,
Did
I
you
have
earn
a
your
clarinet?
living from music?
No, I didn't start learning money from music. The first gig I earned from music was in Auckland. And I guess I'd have been about 16 or 17, playing a very seedy club called the Polynesian Club at just off Karangahape Road for any New Zealanders who were here. And it was a pretty popular sort of place, pretty wild. The only Sunday night I didn't go down there, I used to go down every Sunday night, it's a jam session, someone was knifed on the bandstand.
Oh.
Yeah, a couple of vocalists, which you believe were arguing about who's going to sing next. And then the guy asked me to stay on, and I played down there and got 10 bob a night, which was a reasonable amount in those days.
I better sharpen up my stiletto.
Yeah, that's right. I told Dad, and he said, "Oh, don't tell your mother."
So, as a 15 or 16-year-old, you were in these notorious joints playing jazz. Is that what we take from that?
No, that's the only notorious place.
Oh, okay.
But otherwise, it was a matter of meeting other musicians my age, and we'd do gigs mainly in church halls or weddings or whatever.
Yeah.
And it was the usual sax, piano, and drums.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say that was
Saturday night dance sort of thing.
Yeah. There were one or two dance halls around that had Dixieland bands, or bands who could play Dixieland.
Yeah.
But you've got to remember, as I said, in my early days, I did a lot of listening to jazz, a lot of reading about jazz. I was building up a very good collection of jazz 78s, and I didn't have a very high regard or impression of the Dixieland bands that were playing in Auckland.
Right.
They just didn't have the repertoire.
Yeah.
In fact, I lent one of them a copy of the Pete Daly recording of South, and they said, "Hey, that's great," and they played it, and it went down well at the jazz concert. Do you remember in those days they used to have jazz concerts in the town halls and this, that and the other? But no, there wasn't a lot of depth of knowledge of Dixieland, and there were very few Dixieland musicians. There were good musicians who could play Dixieland and play in a symphony orchestra, but not specialists.
So at what point would you say that you sort of became a jazz musician, getting sort of a regular work as a jazz musician, or something where you feel that you really started rather than just playing for dancing?
Well, that would have been many years later.
Yeah.
And I think I left New Zealand to come over here around about 1960, I think it was. Now, prior to then, I'd played with a sort of a mainstream band at a dance hall in Auckland at the other end of Hobson Street that was mainly patronised by islanders, and we got taken over by the rock and roll boys. I remember one night we were playing and some young guy came in with a guitar and said could he sit in. It was a very young Johnny Devlin. I don't know if anyone remember him, but he was the
I seem to remember the name.
New Zealand's answer to whatever the Australian equivalent was in those days. Johnny, what's his name? Anyway.
Johnny O'Keefe.
Johnny O'Keefe, yes, that's right, yeah. So we left that, and there was a guy who was building up a record label. He sponsored us to play in a dance in one of the suburbs, and it was billed as the Merv Thomas Dixielanders. Right. And we played a lot of Dixieland, but we also did a lot of show band stuff, and that was a very good environment because we did the Louis Prima stuff, the whatever was on the hit parade that we could handle, all the Paul Anka Diamond songs who came out the first time round in those days. Yes. We did all those. Then I left, came over here and met up with some musicians in Sydney, and I clearly remember going into the city one night with the guitarist who I'd worked with in Auckland, a guy called Jim Allison, and we had a Chinese meal and wandered off down whatever the street was and came across Adam's Tavern in Sydney, and we heard music coming up from the basement, had an entrance to a basement down
Yeah.
there. We went down there, it was the Ray Price Quartet playing, and that was the first time I heard live jazz.
Uh-huh.
Of two front line, clarinet, trombone, piano and banjo. They were playing 4 nights a week, so we ended up going there 4 nights a week.
Great.
Yep. And then I moved up to Darwin for a while, and there were not many musicians there. One guy up there called Ross Anderson, who I think is still leading quite a popular traditional band in Melbourne called the Melbourne Jazz Band, New Melbourne Jazz Band, whatever it is.
Uh-huh.
And we found a Eurasian guitarist up there, guy just learning trombone, so we had our own band going, and we played in one of the pubs in Smith Street opposite the theatre, and we played 3 nights a week, so I guess that was my regular gig.
Yeah.
So it took many years to do that, and that was good fun.
Yeah.
That really was good fun.
So this wasn't really a way of making a living at this time for you?
It was still a hobby. I'd sort of talk myself into getting a day job.
Yeah.
So with the pub gig, it paid 25 bob an hour, all the grog thrown in.
Yeah.
Which could have had serious consequences.
Now you started off with the clarinet, Tony.
Yep.
But I believe you play other instruments as well.
Yes, over the years I've tackled the alto, the soprano sax, but I'm left with the tenor sax now.
Right.
Oh, and didgeridoo, which I've got and used on one of my recordings because
Okay.
it's pitched in A flat.
Yeah. Do you find that those instruments are as enjoyable or interesting to play as the clarinet, or is that still your first love?
It depends entirely on the tune that I'm playing. It also depends on the style of music I'm playing. I don't like playing sax in a banjo group.
Right.
At all. With one exception, and that exception was had a very important effect on me. A long time ago, they booked a band to play at a place called Wepstead Manor out at Cleveland, Capalaba, Redlands Bay area.
Yeah.
And they wanted a band just to sort of play outside. So there was Rick Price, the late Rick Price, myself, bass player, and I think Wally first was on banjo, and we were sort of entrenched in the pergola outside, and then a storm came along, and of course difficult to play. So I said, look, why don't we had all our PA and stuff. I said, why don't we just put all the PA away, go into the restaurant, and just walk round playing acoustically.
Yeah.
And they said and we did that for several years, and we got through an incredibly wide range of material. We're doing bebop stuff as well. Now, in that setting, we had a good banjo player and a good bass player, and Rick and I could handle whatever was required in the front line, and that was a very musical little quartet. We even did a spot at the recently formed Queensland Jazz Action Society. We got quite a favourable write-up of what we were doing.
How did bebop work with the banjo? Was it?
Well,
did it sound right? Or?
There are banjo beboppers around. There's a Japanese guy, I think, who plays fabulous pop banjo.
Okay.
It's not the sort of number one instrument of a bebop. No, in that case, Alan, we just had the chords of whatever we were playing, and we didn't bother about playing the flat fifth, 9 minus 11th, sharp 10th, and whatever. We just kept it to the basic chords. But it worked.
Well, I guess that's one of the great things about jazz is that almost anything goes. There's a lot of experimental music in jazz, different lineups, and like when Jerry Mulligan first did Without a Piano.
Great group.
Some people were shocked, and some people thought it was wonderful.
Very good group. That. Yeah. Yeah. Well, people say, "Oh, let's not play that. It's not a good jazz tune." But I say, no. The tune doesn't make jazz, it's the performance makes jazz.
That's right, yeah.
And in some ways I was a little bit ahead of some of my musician friends, because I'd say, look, let's do so-and-so, and I couldn't convey to them the idea I had in my mind which would have made that work. In their mind, it's just a dud tune.
Yeah.
I remember doing at a concert in New Zealand with a band I was playing. We did a good version of the Green Grass of Home. So I said, no, this is what we'll do, and it works, and it did. Not the usual jazz tune.
I think perhaps it's a bit more the quality of the tune, that it can lend itself to being played in different styles, than it is necessarily to the people who play it. I mean, if you've got a good tune, you can play it classically, play it jazz, play it rock and roll, and it works.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I would rather go the other way and look at the straight tune. And I remember at one of the early Noosa Jazz festivals, walking into a room then, Sangster was playing, Johnny McCarthy. They had all the big band, all the big names playing, and it was a slow number. And I thought, what the heck are they playing? It was so moving, and they're all thinking, and you can see they were very involved. And it was Elvis's "Love Me Tender."
Oh, okay.
And boy, they took it to pieces in a most delightful way. Not a good tune, but by gee, what a performance. And yet you can get other tunes like Stardust, Georgia, and I've heard some pretty bad versions of those two, and you probably have too.
Well, just recently I heard a sort of a classical version of a heavy metal tune.
Okay.
And as a heavy metal tune, I would never ever have listened to it or known it, but hearing it played in a classical style, you could see that musically it was a good tune.
Yep.
And you tend to think of heavy metal as sort of three-chord wonders sort of thing. So that's what prompted me to say that I think the quality of the tune's got a lot to do with it.
Well, the tune and the
lend
chords
themselves to different styles of playing.
The tune and the chords. What I like to do is sometimes I wind up that Band in the Box computer program, and I do a workout on Air for a G string.
Yeah.
That must be one of the first jazz compositions, and that was done by Bach in the 15th, 16th century, I don't know. But you look at those chords, and it's a great progression to play over, and that's just what I do. It works in a lot of settings there. I'd go for the tune and a good set of chords.
So, in your career, I mean, you've had an intense interest in the background of jazz. In your career, have you done any what you might call experimental work, or have you stuck
in performance-wise?
Or have you sort of stuck faithfully to the sort of traditional styles?
Okay, well, look, there are several things here. First of all, in a lot of respects, I've sort of worked within existing frameworks and become very involved. I mean, down here at the Jazz Club with the Pacific Jazzmen, and we played here. I maintain that band, including me, played down here more often for no money than any other band in town. That's what it was in those days. We enjoyed it. We weren't doing it full time, and it was a good blow. And on a Sunday night, this place was packed.
Yes.
We played in that corner over there, and the guy, if you sort of move that stand across the stage across, you'll probably still see where 4 holes have been plugged. And those 4 holes were there because before we played, Bill Atkinson, who was managing the club, used to come along with this metal fence, or sort of little barrier that he used to drop in there.
Oh, yeah.
So we had a barrier to keep the crowd off the bandstand. We weren't up high at all.
They didn't dance all over your instruments.
That's exactly right. Now, that place was packed. Now, within that Dixieland framework, I feel I achieved a lot by doing a whole variety of things. For example, we used to do things like Adderley's Sweet Emma, the Motown. Funny enough, we did it here last Friday with Locke's band. So because I ran the band, I was able to bring in a lot of new material.
Yeah.
All I'd do is phone up the other guys and say, do you know this? Do you know that? The trombonist could read. So I thought, okay, tenor trombone, that's no worry. I'd have the chords. And we were getting through a very good success rate of new material while we played, not necessarily at rehearsal.
Yeah.
Now, I did that, and then I formed the big band. Now, I'm a swing era freak. I love Glenn Miller, I love Benny Goodman. So when I formed the band, I said, guys, this is what I want to do. I was building up a library, and they personally preferred more contemporary styles. But they said, okay, Tony, you're organising it. This is what you want to do. We'll do it, and we did. So, and I worked well within that framework. Then when I formed the 8-piece band, which was for Australian jazz, that was a hard one because we had to get a lot of arrangements, and different guys in the band did those arrangements. But we produced 2 cassettes in those days, which we brought out ourselves, and they were very favourably received down south. They said, you guys have really nailed it up here, particularly the first one that came out. So I've had a lot of success in working within existing frameworks. I've achieved a lot of musical goals, more or less, not doing methodically. It's ended up that way. But there's another one I'm looking at now. I've teamed up with a lady singer, and we're looking at doing clarinet and vocal duets.
Okay.
One stage she was going to come along here, but got held up at Kenmore. We're working on some tunes where, okay, she sings, and it's a good practice for me trying to work out the balance between a harmonic and rhythmic background.
Yes.
So she can sing off that. And then the next chorus, she'll have to sing a line to keep a bit of harmony and a bit of rhythm going, so I can ad-lib over that. It's not easy, but it is a good challenge and completely different from anything I've done. Yeah. And I like that. That's what I enjoy doing.
Well, I guess that's the sort of thing I was getting at, because it is easy to get into a comfortable groove, even musically, and just do that for years and years and years.
Yeah.
You mentioned before that the big band.
Yes.
You were one of the founders, if not the founder, of what was then the Brisbane Jazz Club Big Band and is now known as the Brisbane Big Band. So would you like to tell us
I
the
take
story
full
about
responsibility for starting that off.
So you're the bloke what done it. Okay.
It's funny because recently, be a year ago, time flies, I was talking to Rod Bridges at the St John Ambulance concert band rehearsal, and he said, oh man, I've been asked to get something together on the big band. What can you tell me about it? So I wrote it all out, the history. He said, oh man, I thought you'd started it, but I didn't really know all these details. To go back, I mentioned also in those early days, I played in the 5th Field Army Band in the, it's the reserve CMF sort of thing. Excuse me. So that was good experience for my sight reading, because that was pretty poor. And every so often we would have a session where we'd have a small band. Now the small band was about 20 players, and we concentrate on playing swing music. Yeah. Now one of the guys, Rod Taylor, nice young guy, died a few years ago now, and he had a good pack of swing material, all the Glenn Millers and things, and I used to love those sessions. Yes. So that started me off thinking, hey, we've got to have a band doing this sort of thing. And then we were playing at an army blow out at the old Toowong RSL one afternoon, and it was a small band, Sunday afternoon, and I said to Rod, have you got your swing charts handy? You got 3 or 4 numbers? He said, yes, I've got them. So I said to the guys, hey, picked out the guys, said, why don't you come down to the jazz club tonight, Brisbane Jazz Club, the Pacific Jazz Men are playing, but we've got a rhythm section, and we ended up with 3 trumpets, 2 trombones, and the sax section, and the rhythm section was part of the Pacific. Yeah. We went through American Patrol, In the Mood, and Boogie Blues. It's pretty darn rough, but it was the start, and that was towards the end of 1973. So
that was the birth of the big band.
Yes, okay. And it wasn't until next year I spoke to a number of people. I said, look, we should get a band going, and the arrangement was, yes, I said I'll organise it. We picked the last Thursday in each month. I said to the guys, we'll rehearse on the last 2 Mondays of the month, and I was getting 100% turn up for rehearsals.
Wonderful.
And every guy had his name on the chair because I picked them.
Yeah.
And they realised that was the only chance they would have of playing big band music. Now they're guys who could read, they weren't the struggling people. They could read, and a couple of good soloists in the band. And they became keen too, and they were very, very loyal. That started off in June 1974, just round about my birthday. That's right. And we continued on, as I said, till the end of 1976. And at that point I said, look, fellas, I'm giving it up. So over that period of time, for about 10 months of the year, we had a concert down here. And after a while, we'd invite other musicians in to form small bands. And so it was really never had a good crowd. And through the contacts from the Army Band, we were able one night to get some musicians down from the symphony orchestra to perform a sort of a jazz rock number that the bandmaster Ron Milliner had written, which we played in the Army Band. And I said, how about we do that down the club one night? And he said, yeah. So he came down, conducted it, and one of the warrant officer, who was the principal oboe, said, oh yeah, okay, I'll grab a few people from the QSO. So we had a greatly expanded big band. There was another night when I said to some of the guys in the vintage jazz band, look, why don't you come down and we'll do a feature. Now there's a very intricate Duke Ellington number called Black and Tan Fantasy. It was one of his first.
I've seen that chart. I've never heard it played.
Yeah, jungle music they called it. Now John Brabham, the vintage, knew it straight off the record, and the arrangement I had was right off the record. So I got the vintage rhythm section down, and on that particular number I said, okay, John, you sit up there next to John Noble, who was playing lead, and he'll do all the background stuff. You just play exactly what you play with the vintage. And it just fitted like a beautiful jigsaw. And I still got that tucked away on tape.
Really?
And it just worked. He knew his part, the band were reading, and little gems like that make it all seem worthwhile.
Yeah.
So I was expanding within a big band format. As I said, my latest interest is getting it going with this vocalist, because that's a very mobile sort of group, and talking it over with the lady, there's unlimited potential for that, and that's what I was working on.
There's a lot more work around for duos than there are for big bands as well.
You're right.
Though this was back in 1974.
Well, that particular show would have been sometime between 74 and the end of 76.
Are there any of the musicians still around now, apart from yourself, who were in that band at that time?
They're around.
People like Mel Bongers or Bruce McCullum? Or
Mel was one of the original players.
Yeah.
Gene St. Ledger was.
Yes.
That's all. Now, Bruce actually came in after I left the band.
Oh, okay.
Vince Hardiker used to pop in and out. Whenever we expanded the brass section, the trumpets from 3 to 4, Vince would come in and play it. Likewise, we'd expand the trombones from 2 to 4. We went from a 5 to an 8 brass. Yeah. Like the standard charts you see nowadays. The stuff the guys were itching to play. I wanted to do the Miller stuff.
It was Vince who introduced me to the jazz club originally.
Ah, okay.
Met up with him on a little gig, And
still playing well.
Yes.
Yeah, still playing well.
And over the years, I suppose a lot of musicians have gone under the bridge as far as being in and out the big band are concerned. These days, Mel's still playing with the big band.
I don't think he is, and I think Gene's given it up.
Gene's given it up, but Mel was here a month or two ago.
Okay, right. Yeah,
when
right.
I was on. So that's great. I mean, that's like over 30 years.
Yeah. Well, just on that point about who's still there and who's not. As you know, I'm the treasurer of a recently formed association, Queensland Jazz Archive, where we're trying to grab everything and file it, document it, and say, right, we're starting off from here. And I've been very aware of the lack of knowledge around here, particularly in the jazz club, the history of the jazz club. Now, if you will look in that far corner, you'll see in the dark bit on the right-hand side where the two sides meet, just to the right of the exit sign on this side of the wall, there is a picture. You can't see it, it's too dark, about that size, okay? And I think it's still there because nobody knows what it's about.
Right.
And I think sooner or later, and this is what really bothers me, someone will look at it, and because they don't know anything about it, they'll chuck it out.
Yes.
Now, those are photos. There are photos there of the original Brisbane Jazz Club Big Band with the people in, and the club ought to have a competition sometime. Who recognises them?
Where are they now, kind of thing.
That's right.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
there are a few other photos there of the Pacific Jazzmen playing. You know, that's a darned important photo, and yet no one knows it. And as I said, I bet it'll be thrown out because, you know, it's great having all those photos of the contemporary players. That's great, but gee, where's your tradition?
There really
Where's your
ought to
history?
be some captions with them to say who and what they are.
Well, we used to
and
have
when
a
they
whole
were.
series of photos, pictures along the front.
Yes.
And you may remember this.
Don't know what happened to those that were above the bar there.
That's what I was getting at.
People who've passed
Right,
on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was greatly privileged once because someone asked me to, and this is before they realised it was for people who'd died. They asked me for mine to put up there because I was really famous in those days.
But I'm not dead yet.
Yeah, and I put it up and someone pinched it. I thought, well, it must have been a turn on to someone. See, my membership number of the jazz club is actually 00. I joined before they actually, and I've still got the card. I joined before they actually allocated a number. So I come in and show it to the people, 00. It looks a long story.
You know, I think it's really wonderful and it's very important. It may not seem it right at the moment, but down the track, when people are studying or just out of general interest to see what went on in Brisbane some years before, to be able to find these archives, which will date back to when, Tony? The 70s or earlier? 60s?
Well, my involvement really started here around about 68, 69.
Yeah, so they'll go
course.
back at least that far.
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, I was talking to Melissa quite some time ago, and she said she started to scan in club documents
Yes.
into the computer,
Yeah,
so that
that's
will
good.
be available for the archives.
Yes.
But you see, jazz has this remarkable ability, although it hasn't happened for quite a few years, of going back to the past. You have revivals. Now, in America it started off at the height of the swing era,
Yeah.
you know, right through to the early 1940s. There was a group of musicians on the West Coast who started playing the King Oliver music about 20 years earlier. That started off the Dixieland Revival. When that started, they fossicked around and found there were still quite a lot of those original musicians still alive, and they came out of retirement, a la Kid Ory, for example,
Yeah.
Bunk Johnson, George Lewis,
Yeah.
and they did very well. And again, at the other end of the 50s, that went into the Dixieland Revival, and it spread over here, and there was a period in Australian jazz between 1949 and 51 where a number of bands down south, Southern Jazz Group from Adelaide, Bell Band, Frank Johnson, Dixielanders, their recordings were rated as some of the best at that time from anywhere in the world. That's how good Australian jazz was in those days.
It still is, I reckon.
Well, remember, I do say, when I say jazz, I mean traditional jazz.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, you don't hear a lot of original Australian jazz now. Okay, at the conventions they have an original tune competition, and that's great. But you don't hear a lot of Australian jazz bands playing original compositions. As I said, that was why I started off the Yerba Buena band with Titch Ray.
Yeah.
I said, hey, Titch, because he was one of the pioneers of traditional jazz in Melbourne. I said, Titch, let's start a band doing that original stuff. And he was a keen little guy, and boy, oh, yeah, blah, blah. And the result was a very good cassette. When he died, we got Brian Douglas in on second trumpet,
Yeah.
and we did another one. Original competitions, because no one else did them, because no one else is really aware of the tradition.
Yeah.
Okay, at least it's recorded, it's done.
Well, I suppose it's appropriate that maybe even in the height of the popularity of one form of music that people do say, well, why don't we resurrect some of the good old music, you know, before this the current one that's popular becomes too entrenched, and that's probably why that has happened and swung the pendulum back a bit.
Well, it's an interesting point because now when the heck was it? In the 80s I went on a boat cruise, and I went along because I'd received a brochure from Graham Bell saying that his band was playing. And it's a modern group too, and I said, yeah, I thought I'd go along with that, see if I can get a tax deduction, which I did. And I said to Graham, during the cruise, I said, look, you could, because he's saying even at that time the scene was starting to dry up and die. I said you could well see there could well be a day when people will be banging on your door saying, hey, we've been researching this, and you went to Prague after the war, before the country turned communist, and you played in Prague, brought out some 78s because they ran out of money, and the only good form of currency over in Europe at that time was jazz records. So
Really?
They produced their own, sold them and financed their trip. Darn good records too. I said, and they then went over to England. That was their first tour. But I said, you'll find that people will become interested in that, and they'll want to do that again. Just the way in the 40s people were saying, hey, let's get some of these New Orleans musicians back who are still alive.
Yeah.
And as I said, that's when you got the revival movement. I said, that could well happen to you, Graham. Hasn't happened yet. Oh, well, they've recently produced a CD of all of Graham Bell's compositions. So I guess something's happening there.
It's a little bit like Ray Price did, wasn't it, with the Buena Vista Social Club, the old Cuban musicians who were all in their 80s and re-recorded them, and then after that one or two of them died off, and he managed to get that all in the studio before that happened, and for posterity really, you've got some wonderful Latin American music, same sort of thing.
Yeah, if I'm on a gig and it's not going too badly, I say to the guys, hey, look, just remember, in 20 years' time, your name will be in lights because you'll be revived and you'll be famous then. They were never amused by that comment.
Tony, as well as being a very dedicated musician, you've also been a mover and shaker. You've been an organiser. You've been pretty good with the paperwork, pretty good with committees and starting up groups and organisations. So that seems to be one of your fortes, taking your starting of the archive as a case in point. So you've always had a bit of a flair for that side of things as opposed to just playing music.
Oh, that is true. And what happened is I find somewhere along the line something's popped up, and it was something needed to be done, like starting up the club here. And when I say starting up, there was the jazz club started off in a nominal sense. It started off simply because the Adventurers Club, who were running the place, ran out of ways of getting liquor licences for their different... do you remember the old ball licence that they used to have in those days, where someone would go down saying, we're having a series of functions, we want licences, and the commission would say, yeah. And because Bill Atkinson had been busted by the licensing commission in the old premises up there in Newstead, he said he wasn't terribly popular there, so he said, look, we've got to get a new name. So I picked a name, we'll call it the Brisbane Jazz Club. Would I go in and organise the licences? So I said, that was all right. Now, that worked on well. The Pacific just continued to play over there in that little corner every Sunday night and had a ball. And then I remember Bill phoning up, very concerned one morning, saying the licensing commission, is there a statute of limitations on this sort of thing? We'll find out. Anyway, saying that the licensing commission have been on to us. They want us to present our books of account for this jazz club.
Books?
Yeah. So, as it so happened, the guy who I had rehearsing the big band, a very good trombonist called Errol Clyde, was very high up in the state public service.
Okay.
He was the deputy to Gordon Chalk when Gordon Chalk was treasurer. So I phoned up Errol. I said, hey, Errol, because, he used to come down. Hey, Errol, we got this problem. we've been busted. What can you find out? So he said, oh, yeah, hang on, I'll call you back. And he called back in 10 minutes. And he said, yeah, apparently a couple of the investigators came down on a Sunday night, got through the door without having to sign in, no request for membership. And they were given a ticket, which was then taken by someone from them when they came inside, and they were able to go up to the bar and buy a drink.
Yeah.
So they wanted details of membership. I said, how the heck did you get that information now? Oh, I just said, this is Clyde from the Treasury. What's your interest in the Brisbane Jazz Club? So they told. So I said to Bill, OK, I'll dummy up. Remember, I'm an ex-accountant, so I dummied up some figures, which were actually factual, I might say, but in the context completely wrong. By that time, Bill Atkinson came up and said, oh, look, we can afford, and this is very early 70s, we were playing for nothing. Look, we can give you guys a couple of dollars a night to play. That's fine, we'd have played anyway.
Yeah.
So I said, OK, now the members are the Pacific Jazz Band, and the receipts are so many by $2, a very creative accounting. So Bruce Haley, who was the president, and I wandered in and saw the licensing commission and said, they're our figures. Oh, he looked at it and said, it looks to me as if this club comprises the members of the Pacific Jazzman and Bill Atkinson. I don't think really it justifies getting a license. Could you do something about it? Now, that was the point. I said, OK, we've got to get a constitution. And I had a copy of Jazz
You got
Line.
to do a proper job.
Yeah, we got the Victorian Jazz Club's constitution, modelled ours on that, and I remember talking to Gloria Davey. She said, OK, we'll see what we can do. That was the start of the Jazz Club in a
Really?
formal legal sense.
Yeah.
They had a lot of other hassles, which I can tell you about if we had time, but that's how it started.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you did that, and from the little bio that you gave me,
Yeah.
when you arrived this evening, I see that you were the Secretary Treasurer of the 31st Australian Jazz Convention. That would have been quite an undertaking.
It was, because that was the last convention where you had 1 year's notice to prepare.
Yeah.
All now conventions nowadays, with one exception, you have 2 years' notice. And a group of us went down to Balmain for the 75th convention, put up a proposition, and Milam and I organised it. He'd browbeated the ABC in allowing him to have a radio program on a Saturday morning, I think it was, called Stomp Off, Let's Go. Very good program. So he was building a lot of interest in jazz.
Yeah.
He wrote a regular column for the Courier Mail. And I phoned him up, and also he organised a band at the Melbourne Hotel that used to play on the Friday night that was getting as near as possible to an Australian style. I said, hey, Marlon, you're doing well. Have you ever thought of having a convention in Brisbane? He said, I've thought of nothing else. I said, OK, you be president, I'll be secretary-treasurer, and we'll go for it. And that was the start of it.
Right.
And it did turn out to be a very big convention. We had a lot of good bands there. We got a lot of flack from down south because it seemed to me half the people in Melbourne didn't come up because they thought we'd stuff it up, and the other half came up thinking we were going to stuff it up. And we didn't. It was good. It had the largest budget. Our gross input was something like $74,990 something, just short of the 75,000. And every cent was accounted for. You may think that's a bit odd when you consider there was a convention before at Canberra where they had a mysterious fire after the convention. All the records were burnt.
Oh dear.
Plus the part of the Canberra racecourse, or the Queanbeyan racecourse, and there'd been a number of conventions that did not produce accounts.
Right.
So conventions didn't have a bad record of a very good record of accounting for their money. Ours was audited.
Yeah.
Okay, the auditor was a jazz fan. He used to audit the RECQ accounts while I was there, but
Right.
he was interested. He was a good jazz fan, and he made sure we accounted for it. Yes, it was a very big show.
You've since then you've also been the Queensland representative on the AJC steering committee. What does the AJC stand for, Tony?
Australian Jazz Convention. Now that was
Oh,
what I
okay.
said started off in the late 40s, and once after a few years, they found that it was becoming very well attended, and they were getting all this money, and they didn't know what to do with it. So they said, well, we start a trust fund, and they had a number of trustees who've sort of changed over the years. And then they found that that too was getting pretty large, so they appointed a board of people, mainly from different states, to act as a steering committee for the trustees, and they'd meet every year. And I was grabbed as one of the few Queenslanders who used to go to a convention. So I was on that. Gave it up when I started travelling.
You were also treasurer of the Queensland Jazz Action Society.
Yeah, I can't remember.
Is that defunct now?
No, I think they changed their name. It's been going on for
Did
the
that
whole
become
of
Jazz
it.
Queensland?
I think so, because Lynette Irwin moved in, and we appointed her to that position for Jazz Action.
Yeah.
And I think a number of years later, after I left, she changed the format to whatever it is now.
Right. And I see that you did a lot of work with young musicians, organising jazz workshops or trad jazz workshops.
Yeah, well, Von Gazard
here in the club.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Von Gazard, who was a very active president of the club.
She was.
Yeah, you remember Von,
yes.
and she wanted to get these workshops going, and she tried different people and just couldn't get it off the ground, and she asked me. And it coincided with a friend of mine from New Zealand coming over to run the jazz course at the Con, Bernie Allen.
Oh, Bernie.
Oh, you remember Bernie?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Bernie. Good sax player and piano player too.
I'd known him for years in Auckland, so he took
and
over.
He's pretty busy over in New Zealand.
Oh, yes.
These days too.
Yeah. So when he got settled here, I said, look, Bernie, Von wants to do this down the club. Von said she'd do all the administration and because she was getting calls from people, my mum saying, look, Johnny wants to learn jazz. So she accumulated all those. So she had the students.
Yeah.
I do all the organising and say to Bernie, look, this is the path we want to go. So he said, that's okay. And he would just come in and run the show. That was later taken over by Ken Evans, who ultimately took the band down to Melbourne for the 50th convention.
Right.
They put on a couple of spots down there.
Yeah. You've so that's been your sort of organisational career, as you might say. But as a musician, you've also been featured in a number of bands which have been very well known. Dennis Hollingsworth and the Cloudland Dance
Band,
yes, which only sort of wound up a couple of years ago and still does the odd gig here and there.
We do features down
Swing
here once
Fever.
a year. Yes, Joe Webster's band, yes.
The Glenn Miller tribute show band.
Yeah, Andy Walker's band, yes.
Yeah. And you've done a little bit of journalism too, writing columns for Victorian magazines and Sydney magazines.
Yeah, well, I was very aware that Brisbane didn't have much of a jazz scene. They didn't think much of Brisbane interstate, you're a Queenslander sort of thing. And for years I'd go along to the conventions and there wouldn't really be a good turnout of Queensland musicians at all. So when 75 came along and we were pushing to get the convention up here, which we put the proposition up in Christmas 75, no, that's right, it was the following year. We'd been given the convention. I wanted to let the turkeys down south know what we were doing. So I met a guy down there who was editor of a magazine called Jazz Down Under.
Yeah.
Met him at the Balmain convention, and he said, look, would you like to do a Queensland article for me? And I said, yeah, I'll do that. So I would do the Queensland article, which was basically the Brisbane article, and basically the main feature was the jazz convention and all that was going on. So that was the thrust of that. That was for a magazine that's now defunct. Along the line, some years later I had a call from Claire Hanson. He said, oh, look, Tony, I've been writing for the Jazz Line, that's the Victorian Jazz Club member.
Yeah.
But I can't do it anymore, would you take it over? So I said, yeah, that's all right. So I continued with that for a few years. And then some years later, I went back to Auckland for the 30th anniversary of a band I'd played with in Auckland, the Merv Thomas Dixielanders. And the guy came up to me, the editor of Quarterly Rag, the Sydney magazine. I'd never met him before. I knew of him by name. And he said, well, I'd like to do a column for the Sydney magazine. So I said, yeah. So that was that. And then later I started doing this discography of New Zealand jazz records. And he was very much into discographical work. So he printed it, serialised it in the magazine. And I think there have been one or two other little things I've done along the way.
Great. So you've done that, and of course you've also gravitated to doing a bit of radio work. You've had a program on
yes,
on
back in
jazz
the days,
radio program.
Yeah, well, 4MBS was still playing jazz.
Yes.
Someone asked me if I could do it, and luckily in those days you could go in and record your program on the little DAT tape, I think it was, so I could go in and quietly do it, and then someone would put it on. I did that for several years, and then they were asked me if I'd do one for the FM station down the coast. Is that 94?
Oh, 94.1.
Yeah, that's
Radio
right.
Hope Island.
Yeah, and they had
totally jazz. Yeah.
Yeah, we had something like 2 hours, may have been more, to play with there, and that was great. I used to drive down and put on the show live, and yes, I did that for a while. Yeah, because by that time I'd accumulated a very large collection of jazz records. I'd still got a couple of thousand 78s, so I've still got 1,000 or so LPs, and I've still got a lot of CDs. So I've always had a good collection, so I could draw on any of those.
I'd say we were very lucky to have somebody like yourself that that is prepared or happy to build up a collection like that and know all about it and has the acumen to write about it and broadcast about it, because otherwise it would just be one of those things that came and went. You know, well, just live shows. This way we're getting a history built up.
Yeah, as I said earlier on, that in my early days at school I did a lot of reading. I read. There wasn't much in the way of jazz books around, 48, 49, but I did a lot of reading. There was a very good publication that came out in England called The Melody Maker.
Oh, I used to get that.
Yeah. Well, in those days, it was good. Now I think it's just another trade magazine for guitarists or something. Not that there's anything wrong with guitarists.
There was another newspaper.
There's Jazz Journal. Now Jazz Journal is still going, so I read all those.
The Stage, that was the sort of show business one. New Musical Express.
Yes, I used to subscribe to that.
Yeah. To get that.
So there was a lot of reading to be done, and I read all of those things. So as I said, I had a very good knowledge of that. And I started to collect the records. I used to import them when I was in New Zealand. I used to ride away to the London Jazz Club bookshop in St John's Wood and get them in from there, 78s. Yeah.
Well, Tony, we've spent the last 50 minutes or so, which really doesn't time fly when you're enjoying yourself.
Indeed.
Talking.
Yes.
And you're not just a talker, you are a musician.
Right.
And I think we wouldn't be doing justice to the evening if we didn't ask you to demonstrate your love and your skill for your instrument and play something for us.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'll drink to that.
And we should preface that by saying that in this vast audience this evening, we have a lady who's celebrating her birthday.
Oh, right.
So if he can't play anything else, I'm sure he can squeeze out a little bit of happy birthday.
This is important.
Ladies and gentlemen, Tony Ashby with Happy Birthday. Happy birthday, dear. Happy birthday to you. Good. Wonderful.
Speech.
We didn't get the lady's name. Angela, thanks for being with us tonight, and very happy. Tony, are you going to play something proper for us now? Please, yeah. Just want to put the mouthpiece on again.
For Angela. happy birthday, Angela.
Yeah.
That
That was memories.
Thank you. Memories of you.
Memories of
or
you.
if you're from New Zealand, memories of yous.
Of you.
You can have whichever way you prefer.
Okay. It is our tradition in these interviews, after we've grilled you,
Good.
to not let you off the hook. We allow the audience to grill you as well. So,
Questions?
so if there are any particular questions that members of the audience would like to put to Tony, take your chance right now.
I'd just like to make a comment and say it's been fantastic listening to your stories. I'm so happy that I came tonight to all the rain and storm.
So are we.
We're
We are
even happier.
very appreciative.
It's really wonderful what you've done, and I think what you're going to do as well.
Thank you kindly. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
That's great. And the other bonus there is that in about 20 years' time, when somebody blows the dust off the CD, they will hear your voice making those comments from the jazz archives.
Like a copy of tonight, that'd be fantastic. So
Leave your name at the door, and I'll leave it with Alan.
Now, Tony gave us a copy of a video of the 1976 Australian Jazz Convention, which was held actually here in Brisbane.
That's right, at the university.
Which one was that? Which number was that? The
31st.
That was the 31st.
Yes.
It runs for 45 minutes. So if you'd like to see it, we will be happy to put it on. And I have previewed it, and it's quite fascinating, especially to see the hairstyles back in '76.
And we did have hair in those days too.
Yeah. Tony, we're absolutely delighted to have you with us, and I'm sure we could have gone on for another 50 minutes and still not run out of puff.
Yes.
And perhaps we should get you and Bobby McGee together one night, do a 3-hour session. So please show your appreciation once again for Mr. Tony Ashby.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Tony.